Hey folks, so welcome back. Now we are going to start talking about these different speech sounds and the different ways that we classify them. So as I talked about last time, when we talk about classifying speech sounds, we're not going to have enough time to go into the total details of classification. If you're interested in things like linguistics or phonology or things like that, that is absolutely something to look into, but I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. So when we classify speech sounds, we can classify them in the following ways. So first of all, we can classify them based on the place in the vocal tract where airflow may be obstructed, how airflow is obstructed or the manner of articulation, and then whether or not the vocal folds are voiced or vibrating. So let's first start by talking about places of articulation for consonants. Vowels tend to be very open mouth sounds. The vocal tract is very, very open, but largely we're going to talk about consonants. And I would highly encourage you, if you're interested, and I promise you, if anybody in your house looks at you like you're weird for doing this, tell them I recommended it. They can think I'm weird for this. But I would highly recommend that you actually sound out these different consonants. And I want you to pay very close attention to what parts of your vocal tract are actually moving when you do this. So you can figure out the places and the manner of articulation. So sound it out and be exaggerated with it, because that might make it a little bit easier for you to notice. So we're going to start by talking about the place of articulation. Now, these are certainly not all of the places that these can be articulated, but I want you to kind of pay attention to these different sounds. These are just some of the ways that we can articulate them. So sounds can be articulated at the lips where airflow is obstructed. So we can do a B, so you can kind of feel B. So you can see how my lips kind of close together, B, and then push out. We can do P, which is a little bit different. So B was very, very big, a very, very big movement. P is a smaller movement, still making use of the lips though. And then so again, m, so again, airflow is being obstructed in the lips for all of those cases. We can have airflow be obstructed at the alveolar ridge right in front of the teeth. So duh, duh. Feel where that tongue goes at the roof of your mouth. Duh. Mine fits right on that ridge. Now try ta, ta. Duh is a little bit more in the back. So you can feel that duh is a little bit farther back in the alveolar ridge. Ta is a little bit in front of the alveolar ridge, and it's actually kind of close to the teeth. So duh and ta, ta, ta. So think about where the tongue is landing on the roof of your mouth. There are going to be some differences there. Or n, n. The tongue goes right up against the teeth on that alveolar ridge. And then we can also have the soft palate. Now, you're not really going to be able to feel your tongue here, but notice some of the differences. So ga, ga. You can kind of feel g, g. It's at the back of the mouth. Ka, ka. It's at the back. Ng, 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 ng. Ng is kind of in the back as well. So those are all places that are obstructing airflow at the soft palate, and ing in particular is also making use of that nasal tract. Okay, so we've talked about place of articulation. Now let's talk about manner of articulation. So airflow can be either totally obstructed, so ba, ba. So we stop the flow of air. It's part of the reason that the sound ba is actually referred to as a labial stop. So we call it a labial stop because labial means lips, so it goes ba, so it involves place on the lips, and it's a complete stop of airflow. So we call it a labial stop. Ba, da, g, pa, ta, and ka. All of those have airflow that is totally obstructing. Notice that each of them has a slightly different placing in the vocal tract. So ba and da are closer to the front of the mouth. Ga is closer to the back. P is, again, using the lips. T, using that alveolar ridge. And K is using the velum. We can have partial obstructions, so S. So there is some airflow still going, so S is what we call a sibilant. Sibilants hiss. So S, Z, Z. F is what we call a fricative because it involves a little bit of friction between the lips. F, V, Th, and Sh. All of them have a partial airflow obstruction. You can still feel some air going through, which is why you get that sh or hissy kind of sound with some of these. We have slight obstructions, so la, the mouth is very open, ra, wa, and ya. All of them keep a very open mouth. We have some that start blocked, but then open up, like cha and ja. And then we have other ones that are blocked at the mouth, but go through the nasal passage. So n. You can almost feel the airflow going up toward the nose. N, m, and ng. You can almost feel it just go right through the nose. So that's manner of articulation. And then we can talk about voicing, whether or not the vocal folds vibrate. So the vocal, I want you to kind of feel your throat here. So I'm going to make all of these sounds. B, m, z, l, r. All of those cases, you can actually feel the vibration of the vocal folds. So we would say that those are voiced. Now, on the other hand, put your hand up to your throat and go pa, 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 s, s, cha, cha. No vocal fold vibration. So in those particular cases, those are what we call unvoiced consonants. The vocal folds do not vibrate when you produce them. So one of the things is that obviously each of those speech sounds are separate, but when we combine those different consonants with vowels, the sounds start to blend into each other. And as I mentioned, when we talked about spectrograms, really the speech signal is really a long, uninterrupted sound signal. And speech production is actually incredibly fast. We produce up to 10 to 15 vowels and consonants per second. Now, when you think about how much we're producing in a very short time, one of the things that ends up happening is what is known as coarticulation. So one of the things that we find is that these different speech sounds overlap in the acoustic pattern. So what this means, for example, is that the B that we pronounce in bill is different from the B that we pronounce in ball. And the reason for that is because when we form the B sound, our mouth is already starting to change shape in anticipation for the I sound in bill and the ah sound in ball. And so because of that, the B in bill and the B in ball don't actually sound the same. Portions of your vocal tract are only going to move so fast. Y'all have sometimes seen this where I talk way too fast and it's almost like my tongue gets ahead of me. There is some amount of inertia in your vocal tract and it's only going to be able to move so fast, especially the jaw, the lips, and the tongue. And so because of that, because we know that we have these motion limitations, we start anticipating the next sound that we have to produce, and we position the tract in anticipation of that. So these different sounds blend into each other. So it's why the B in bill sounds different from the B in ball. It's why the D in deem is different from the D that at the beginning of the word doom, because we're co-articulating, so the D sound takes some of the quality from the future sound of E or the future sound of oo in preparation. So co-articulation makes speech perception really hard. And one of the ways that you can kind of see this is with computer programs. How did they actually recognize the D sound in deem, doom, and damn as the same when each of them sounds slightly different from each other with respect to co-articulation? And one of the things that we find is that increased processing power improves speech recognition very, very greatly. So here's kind of one of the ways that we can see this. Let me see if I can talk to Siri. Can you repeat what I'm saying right now for my class?
Sorry, there's nothing to repeat.
So it sounds like they do understand some aspects of speech perception, but they don't necessarily follow the commands entirely. So that's just something to keep in mind. So this is something that computer programs have a lot of problems with. Human beings, though, have one thing that really kind of helps us out. So even though the D in deem, damn, and doom are all slightly pronounced differently, human beings have what is called categorical perception. And so that really cuts down on some of the clutter of each of these sounds sounding slightly different because of co-articulation. So one of the ways that we can kind of look at this, researchers can basically manipulate sound stimuli that vary continuously from ba to da and to ga. So notice each of those. Ba, so that's at the front of the mouth, that's produced with the lips. Da is produced on the alveolar ridge, and ga is all the way in the back with the movement of the velum or soft palate. So they're produced in slightly different areas. And additionally, if you take a look at the frequencies here, so here's what ba is. So here is formant 1, formant 2, and formant 3. Here's da, formant 1, formant 2. Now notice that whereas here both of these formants are kind of tilted a little bit, you can see that the tilt has changed for da, and then here is what it looks like for ga. Now we can present these little hybridized ones that match some aspects of da and some aspects of ga, and here we have some that match aspects of ba and some that match aspects of da. So these are both hybridized. Even when you present people with these hybridized phonemes, people don't perceive these different sounds as being continuously varying. What's interesting is that generally anything that kind of falls in this middle region, you are either going to perceive as either ba or da. Or if it's over here, this little middle area where they overlap, you're either directly going to perceive it as da or you're going to perceive it as ga. So people tend to perceive these really sharp categorical boundaries between the stimuli. You will either hear it as da or ga. You will not get something in the middle of the two. So the question becomes, is speech really special? Is that categorical perception what makes speech special? And I would argue no. Categorical perception is technically a part of all perception, including visual perception. But other people have proposed that speech is a very, very special thing. And one thing that kind of highlights this theory of speech being special is something known as the motor theory of speech perception. And this is basically the idea that we figure out what somebody is trying to say by looking at the motor processes that are used to produce that speech and then basically running that in reverse to perceive that speech. So the idea is we can figure out what somebody is trying to tell us in speech by thinking about the motor processes that are used to produce that speech and effectively running it in reverse. And some of the evidence that people have purported for the motor theory is largely supported by the McGurk effect. And the McGurk effect is basically kind of an interesting finding. I talk about this in cognitive psychology when we talk about visual capture, the idea that what you see influences what you hear. But the McGurk effect is a bit more complicated than that. So the traditional classic McGurk effect kind of works like this. So we have we have a visual image of somebody producing the mouth movements for the word ga, ga, ga. Now, remember when we talked about the different areas that this is placed, the sound ga is produced at the back of the soft palate. So it's at the very back of the vocal tract. At the same time that this person is visually saying ga, they are getting a speaker that is playing auditorily ba. So ba is at the front, ga is at the back. What's very interesting is that the subject ends up reporting hearing da, which actually kind of makes sense when you think about it. Ba is at the front, ga is at the back, and when you combine these signals, you get something that's kind of in the middle. Da is performed at the alveolar ridge at the middle of the vocal tract, the halfway point between the frontward sound of ba and the back of ga. So now we're going to talk about how we listen to speech. So receptive speech occurs well before we ever start producing speech. So an infant's first words are often produced at about 1 year of age, but babies learn to listen before they're ever actually born. Newborns prefer hearing their other voice over other women's voices, which means that they've had some exposure to their mother's voice in utero. We also know that this is also true for native languages. 4-day-old French babies prefer hearing French, what they've been exposed to, over hearing Russian. Now, one of the other things that we know that happens at infancy is that all infants are born understanding speech sounds of all possible languages. This is what's known as a universal grammar. We all come into the world with the built-in capacity to learn any language, but the goal is to eventually become a master of our own native language. And so what ends up happening as we get more and more exposed to our native language is we lose that ability to discriminate between different speech sounds that do not occur in our language. So here's a couple of examples of this. So there are certain types of sound distinctions that are specific to various languages. Here in American English and in English in general, we have a distinction between the sound ra and the sound la. In Japanese, they do not. They are interchangeable. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that when Japanese newborns are actually capable of distinguishing between the ra sound and the la sound. But over time, as they get more exposed to sounds that are relevant to their language, they lose the ability to distinguish between sounds that are not relevant to their native language. So infants begin to start filtering out those irrelevant sounds largely before they actually start to produce speech. So another example that your book gives, there are special variants of the T phoneme in the Hindi language that are produced differently from each other. And for English speakers, they don't sound all that different. So there's a distinction between different types of T sounds in Hindi that English speakers are not capable of hearing. So here's what's interesting. At the age of 6 to 8 months, English infants are actually capable of discriminating between those sounds, but over time, especially as they get closer to saying their first words, they lose that ability and they do not distinguish between those slightly different T phonemes. However, compare that to Hindi infants right before they produce their first words, they are totally capable of perceiving those sound differences because those are relevant to them. So we lose our ability to discriminate between other speech sounds in languages that we're not exposed to. It's part of the reason why generally, if you want to really learn a language, I'm not saying you have to learn it when you're an infant, but generally, the younger you are, the better off you will be. So one of the other critical things that we have to learn when we're segmenting a speech signal that's long and continuous is learning about words and word boundaries. And this is really hard to test with adults because, well, adults have such knowledge of their own native language that it's hard to present them with something that they don't already know. But Safran and colleagues actually tried a really interesting idea with infants. They basically created a novel language like this, and infants listened to different sentences in this fake language for about 2 minutes. And then over time, infants learned to distinguish between words and non-words. So we get Tokibu, Gopila, Gikoba, Tipalu, Tokibu, Gopila, Tipalu, Tokiba, Gikoba. So it sounds like a string. But what's interesting is that certain phonemes are going to occur together and are more likely to occur together. So if I get Toki, it's probably going to be followed by Boo. So what's interesting is that part of the reason you learn about words and word boundaries is because you're basically looking and unconsciously learning what phonemes are more likely to occur together and what phonemes are less likely to occur together. So by the time you've been exposed to this, you can very quickly learn that these are basically 4 different words that you've learned: Tokibu, Gopila, Gikoba, and Tipalu. And so you're basically looking for statistical regularity and taking into account probability. And that's not something you do consciously, but that's how a lot of us have been proposed to learn language. So we're going to finish this up, and I will see you very soon.